Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Economic Update, Recovery and Next Steps for Your Organization. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments.
Thank you, Emily.
Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy.
It's fascinating that we have this event today when most of you probably saw the release this morning with the GDP declining at a 32.9% annual rate in the second quarter, dwarfing anything that any of us on this webcast have ever seen before. I want to start with a point about the notion of radical uncertainty. There's a new book by Mervyn King and John Kay entitled Radical Uncertainty, and it really deals with things or decision-making in that area beyond the probability distribution, beyond the tails of that distribution out to the unimaginable. And that's really the world that we're in. I suspect that most of us back in January did not anticipate that we would have a collection of masks by the end of July of 2020. This would have been the start of the 12th year of the upturn, which looked like that was in the bag back in January. But now we've got, of course, the sudden recession induced by the virus and the policy response. If you look around, we're seeing record low nominal interest rates, a lot of fear. The fabric of our lives has been torn asunder. I mean, the things that we used to do in many cases we can't do anymore or have to do differently. And I suspect that this will be the defining economic event of our lives. Low inflation, massive policy swings, and uneven impacts. I know you're from across the country, at least according to the national news last night. I'm sitting here deep in the red zone where cases have increased dramatically. the recovery has likely started, but we really don't know what it's going to look like. Now, I want to show us, you put this slide up on initial unemployment claims just because it is such, I think, a mind-numbing slide. You look at the bottom of that slide, you see this line going along at just over 200,000 weekly initial claims for unemployment. Then you get to March, and look what happened. Look at the surge that we saw. Then it came down, and then notice on the far right-hand side in the recession, okay, you started to see it increase again. And we had another number this morning, so it increased once again. The monthly changes in payroll employment, again, it's so dramatic. We were sailing along with gains in the 200,000 range, a slight decline in March, and then in April, down almost 21 million jobs, followed by increases in May and June. But it's important, I think, if you look at the detail, the March to April move, a decline of almost 21 million jobs. You can see the sector breakdown there. Basically, everything was down. But notice, about a third of that, those job losses were in that leisure and hospitality sector. Now, if we think about that decline and what we've experienced, it started the lockdown, stay-in-place orders, travel bans, work-from-home orders, closures of non-essential, and I know you're from all over the country, the definitions of these things varied dramatically. It was a patchwork of rules. There was demand destruction by policy, saying businesses had to close, people couldn't do certain things. And, and we saw this morning, I haven't gotten into the detail yet of that dramatic decline in output in the second quarter. It was interesting if you look at average hourly earnings. I mean, earnings soared in April, not because their wages were going up, but because lower income jobs were disappearing. So it pushed up the average, and they actually fell in May and June. Labor force bounced around. People left the labor force in April, came back, and you had some increases in May and June. There's lots of dispute going on as we speak of the impact of the extra $600 a week in unemployment compensation. Is that or is that not impacting people's willingness to go back to work? There may be some measurement issues. The Bureau of Labor Statistics basically said in their releases that the unemployment rate was probably underestimated because of the way people answered certain questions about their work status during the worst days of the downturn. It was a dramatic change. Now, let's try a question. Given the changes in the world, Emily, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you. Our first polling question, are you working remotely? And your options are A, yes, or B, no. I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate in our polls today, please click the button next to the answer you choose and click Submit. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Ellie. That's fascinating. I suspected with this group it would probably be mostly yes, but that's pretty dramatic. And we'll talk more about some of the implications of that later. For the people, who are working remotely, you're probably not buying lunch from the deli down the street or in the building. Less shopping for clothing, all kinds of interesting aspects of that. Now, real GDP growth. Obviously, we got a new number today. I'll ask you to look at this graph, and you can put the bar in for the second quarter. The first quarter was down 5% at an annual rate. This quarter was down 32.9%. So it will be a very dramatic swing. The trough from the previous recession was in June of 2009, and we basically started up then. But you can see the dramatic way in which this ended. Trying to change it here. Now, the percentage, this is the percentage point contribution to growth in the fourth quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2020. Now, we went negative in the first quarter. If you look at that, you look at the red in consumption, you see the dramatic decline in consumption. That was the principal driver with the decline in the growth rate. You also had some help from inventories and the like too, but it was basically consumption. If we were to redo that graph and put up the numbers that came out this morning, we had a negative growth rate of 32.9%. 25 percentage points of that were due to a decline in consumption. So you just make that red bar go down basically 5 times as far. So you see the swing, and you see where it was. Big swings on the consumer side. We talk about inflation. In the year to June, okay, up 0.6% for the total, 1.2% for the core. This is the monthly changes, and notice May, okay, May was down, April was down, March was down, June was up 0.6%. During the worst of the downturn, you saw declines in spending. If we look at some of the categories in the next slide, it's pretty interesting. Gasoline took a big jump in June, but it was down 23.3% over the year. You had that collapse in oil prices. Clothing prices declined for 3 months with a lot of retail operations closed, and then jumped sharply in June. Transportation services were down. You know, airfares, things of that sort over the year with the weakness in that industry. And the food sector, over the year, food at home jumped 5.6%, food away from home 3.1%. If you've looked at that stuff in recent years, that's not been the pattern. The pattern has been more rapid increases in food away from home and relatively stable prices in food at home. But you've had an explosion in demand, changed mix of products, all kinds of increased costs for grocery retailers, and you're seeing a swing as the food industry has to readjust packaging and that sort of thing. So it's sort of fun to watch these things play out. The key important thing from an inflation perspective is it's below the Fed's target. That it is not a major problem at the moment. Now, in thinking about the food stuff, throw in a question about your dining out patterns and see how people have acted. Emily?
All right, our second polling question, have your dining out patterns changed? And your options are A, no change, B, takeout only, or C, eating out less often. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds on this one. All right, back to you, John.
Thanks, Emily. This is interesting. I wasn't sure what people would say, but the eating out less often. Obviously, not good news for the restaurant business, and the takeout only. That's actually higher than I thought it might be. So clearly a change in behavior. We'll come back to that. Well, if you look at what's happened to interest rates, because we got to look at the response to this downturn, and you see the plunge in the 10-year Treasury. This is 2017 up until late last week. And you can see the plunge. Yesterday, the 10-year Treasury was at about 0.58%, which is pretty amazing to think about. We've seen mortgage rates that have dropped into the twos, the lowest mortgage rates that we have ever had. Well, let's look at monetary policy, okay, which obviously is part of what's going on in interest rates. You saw the Fed react to this downturn, okay, back in March. Between meetings, the Fed over the phone cut the federal funds rate twice, taking the funds rate back to that 0 to 0.25% range where it was during the previous recession. You saw the Fed react very quickly to provide liquidity. You know, there's an alphabet soup of programs, but there's commercial paper funding, helping with the Paycheck Protection Program, term asset-backed securities, buying muni bonds, the Main Street Lending Program. I mean, the Fed reacted very quickly to make sure markets would keep on functioning. Now, as you all remember, you know, I'm assuming a lot of us are, of course, in the financial services business. I mean, this didn't start as a financial crisis. This was not like the 2007 to 9 period. But now you have all these businesses and entities with no income or reduced income, reduced revenues. Then suddenly it can become a financial crisis. Loans and stuff that look good, now you got questions about. We've got billions being set aside for potential loan losses. And notice, you know, you've seen all the attention paid to the earnings season for financial institutions. Some of the stuff that the Fed did in 2007 and 2009 has been reactivated. I mean, they went through a major crisis a decade ago, and the lessons learned seem to have been applied. And as you know, the Fed now puts out its long-term forecasts or their statement of where they think rates are going to be. And the last time around, they think the Fed funds rate is going to be down there in that 0 to 0.25% range on out into 2022. So we may well be down around the zero bound. Okay. Now, let's look at fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is very likely to change. It's very likely to change this week or very soon. We saw a very rapid monetary response, and the Fed can move very, very quickly. Fiscal policy, of course, has to go through the Congress and the President, and fiscal policy actually moved pretty rapidly this time. We've had 4 coronavirus bills passed: the Preparedness and Response Act, Families First Act, the CARES Act, which got probably the most attention, the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act. But look at what that was. Stimulus checks, forgivable loans, higher unemployment compensation, help to hospitals, some to states and cities, testing funds, expanded sick leave, nearly $3 trillion in new spending, okay? And notice some of the focus of this was to preserve the firm-employee relationship, okay? with Paycheck Protection Program, the loans could be forgiven if it was used to pay employees. They're trying to maintain that relationship. That's not something we've done often in the United States. You see that more often in overseas. But this was new policy stuff for us, and it happened reasonably quickly. Now the question becomes, what's the next round going to look like? And as we do this morning, the D's passed a bill back in May with about $3.5 trillion in new spending or changes in taxes. The R's came out with a bill a proposal this week, which is substantially smaller. Don't know what's going to happen, where that's going to end. Likely you'll see funds to state and local governments, which have been hit hard, which I'll talk about later. The extra unemployment compensation, the extra $600 a week, that ends, technically it ends tomorrow. Okay. Is that going to be extended, modified, or ended? Some argue for extension. Others argue, no, that's a barrier for people going back to work because a significant fraction of people make more money unemployed than they do when they're employed. If you put the $600 a week plus the state factor, we'll have to see how that ends. But notice, you haven't heard a lot of talk about the deficit lately. We're heading back toward the immediate post-World War II time period in terms of debt level relative to output. It's not a focus now, okay, but it's happening. In June, the deficit just in June was $864 billion. The Congressional Budget Office says this year we're going to be at $3.7 trillion. There may be implications of that, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Now, how did we get there? Remember that deficit's being driven by a number of things. Even had this recession not happened, it was going to be about $1 trillion. But then on top of that, you have the things that happen automatically. Revenues weaken, certain kinds of spending are triggered, the automatic stabilizers. Then you've had these discretionary COVID actions, and we may get more. That's been responsible for boosting the deficit. And the changes in deadlines for taxes have played a role as well. If you want to reflect on this, there's a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Sebastian Mallaby, "The Age of Magic Money. Can Endless Spending Prevent Calamity?" We're really engaged in an experiment about that right now, if we can pull that off. Okay. Now, let's think about sort of the damage and some of the carnage associated with this decline. Now, I was putting the last touches on that, late last week, early this week. We're now over 150,000 deaths. Now, clearly, we've got the unemployment. Now, unemployment, not just the job loss, but there's the other aspects of that. Loss of self-esteem in some cases. I mean, when I was working in the office, I loved going to work to see my buddies. Those links in many cases are severed. Most of you are working from home. Lots of aspects of unemployment beyond simply the loss of job. The financial losses. Businesses that basically have to shut down and may go out of business because they can't survive with the restrictions that are being put on them in terms of percentages of seats they can fill. The financial losses. The expenses go on, the revenues don't stop, and you see all the tales of people lost, businesses that have been around for 20 or 30 years. Okay. the fear and the disconnection. I mean, I happen to live in a building which has lots of older people. I hate to use the word elderly. And a lot of people are very much afraid of going out. And the disconnection, not being able to connect in the old ways with family, friends, there's a cost. There's a cost to that in life, the quality of life. Think about non-COVID medical issues. We went through the period, and I know you're from all different states, but in many cases, elective procedures were banned. So even in hospitals that didn't have massive COVID problems, elective procedures were banned. People became afraid to go. They put stuff off. There's a cost. The dentist's office being shut down. Things of that sort. So those kinds of conditions can get worse. And now you see ads trying to get people, hey, the hospital is open for elective. You can come back in. We're taking the precautions. Different groups, retirees who thought they were going to live off of those CDs, okay? Well, that doesn't work. That doesn't work anymore. They thought they were going to travel, do various and sundry things with the grandkids. Off the table now. Pre-retirees, people saying, okay, I was going to retire, but now I've lost my job, at least temporarily. The company has discontinued 401k matches or discontinued or reduced them. I don't get the same kind of Social Security credits because my income's gone down. Lots of concern there. Millennials, and I don't know how old everybody is, but there's some millennials who they entered the labor force during the Great Recession, had a tough time. Now things are looking better. They had jobs. They were starting to move up, and they might get laid off again. New entrants. Okay, how'd you like to graduate from college or high school this year and say, okay, now I gotta go find a job? It's a different world. It can have very long-term impacts. Now, most of you are working from home, according to that polling question. But people, and so you've probably been able to stay employed, income maintained, that sort of thing. But a lot of people didn't have that option, and they're in a different situation. If you look at the demographics of people who have lost jobs, a lot of stuff going on at the lower income, and people with lower levels of education, minorities, they've been hit very, very hard. There's been an income level impact on this particular cycle. The disrupted education. I mean, we know that when kids aren't in school or getting home or getting school online or not getting schooling at all, you're disrupting the education pattern. It's not as effective. It's got long-term implications. I mean, my daughter is a junior high teacher in Southern California. They went online. 25% of the kids disappeared. I mean, there's long-term impacts of that stuff. You think about the viability of different business models. Think of it, what's going to be like post-coronavirus? We've seen a lot of firms that were household words go bankrupt, couldn't withstand the months of zero or reduced revenues. We could talk about Penny's, Brooks Brothers, J. Crew, the list goes on and on. On the other hand, Amazon, Walmart, Home Depot, grocery stores, Costco, Zoom, we've seen their fortunes change dramatically. Think about if you think about industry impacts, obviously travel and tourism, hospitals, airline, plane makers, colleges and universities. I mean, a myriad of different experiences that we could all tell stories about, but very different impacts. State and local governments, they have balanced budget requirements. You got a revenue hit and you have extra spending. And the risk is that's going to become a drag during the upturn. That happened after the Great Recession. And you saw lots of people, lots of declines in government employment now. The global poverty increase. If you read about what's happening around the world, and you think about, okay, we got lockdowns in the United States, think about doing that in India or Bangladesh, where incomes are much lower. A fraying of global ties, whether we're talking about the blame game or now you've seen articles about vaccine nationalism. Who's going to get it first when it comes? And we don't know where it's going to come. Well, let's look at job growth update. I know you're from all over the country. I love this job growth update material. It comes from the BLS and Arizona State University. They rank states by employment growth. And what I want you to see, this is the June data. It's year over year. And you can see that all 50 states are down. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's only in the last couple of months that I've ever seen it with all 50 states down. Utah at the top of the list. I asked for a list of attendees last week, so I highlighted the states where you were from. We cover the whole range here. Utah is number one, which basically means it's going down slower than other people. Idaho number two, and then look at Hawaii is 50. Okay, not necessarily a surprise there, given the travel and tourism stuff. But you look at this and realize the breadth of this particular downturn. You didn't have this during the oil shocks or other recessions. There were always places that were growing, but that's not the environment that we're in at the present time. Now, this next slide, there's a lot of stuff on there, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can look at it at your leisure. But I went and took the states that I knew were going to be represented here, and I got the federal data for June over the year employment change. And it's sort of interesting. Look at that. You look at that list. You see Hawaii down 16%. Everybody was down. Okay. And then at the same time, I got the June over the month change. Because remember, in that national data, employment was rising in June. There's the May to June employment change. The snapback, for example, in California, you can see a gain in jobs of over 500,000 over the month. Then the unemployment rate. Look at the unemployment rates, how they vary across the country. Now, the last two columns, it's a new set of data, okay, from Track the Recovery, okay, is the source of this. And it's done by Harvard, Brown University, funded in part by the Gates Foundation. And what they do is they look at debit and credit card transactions. And January is the base, the month of January. Okay, and so they compare how things are to January for consumer spending, and then I pulled out hotel and restaurant spending. that we don't have a lot of experience with the data, but it's sort of interesting, and I thought it was interesting, particularly showing the hotel and restaurant spending. Look at the magnitude of the declines, and I have to admit I don't understand the increase in consumer spending in July in Hawaii and Louisiana, whereas the other states were all down, but I double-checked that's what the data said. But it's sort of interesting and gives you a sense of some of the changes in spending patterns. And you could go to that site and look at grocery stores, and I took a slide from there. That's grocery store spending in California, Texas, and Washington relative to January. And look at the increase in spending there, and look at the spike during sort of the early part of the downturn. Huge increases in grocery store spending as people raced out to buy toilet paper. So what's the end game of this? We've seen the relaxation of restrictions. We got basically 50 different experiments going on. Now, it's very likely, we won't know until the National Bureau makes its decision, the recovery probably started late in the second quarter, unless we go negative again. Now, we've had in late July the surge in cases, the reimposition of restrictions, increased fear. So it's slowing down, but whether it'll go negative again, nobody knows. But you have to ask the question, what's going to be left and how is it going to be changed? We had closures. Are we getting restarts, or is this startup in a different world? The vaccine is critical. I mean, to get back to very much what we think of as normal pre-corona, we probably got to get a vaccine. It's probably a prerequisite for a full recovery. And I think what we're talking about is people's behavior. You know, we all wear a lot of different hats, consumers, investors. How will we change our behavior in the face of this massive uncertainty? And I've been thinking about this. If you just look around, look at history, increased savings. After the Great Depression, savings went up. After the Great Recession, savings went up. Back in January of this year, the savings rate in the United States, personal savings as a share of disposable income, was about 7.7%. Okay. In June, it was 23%. Now, some of that may be an inability to spend, but it definitely increased. We're going to pay a lot more attention to the supply chain. Okay. You know, we spend a lot of time taking fat out of the supply chain, going to just in time. Now we'll probably go to just in case. More protectionist, worry about where stuff comes from, try to develop resilience. It'll be, I think, a very different management of that supply chain. What happens to globalization? Okay. Some attempts to avoid China, maybe more regional networks, maybe more cooperation, but it's hard to see that in the current environment. But that's a question I think one has to ask. The geographic implications, okay. Density, you know, we love urban density from a planning standpoint, but maybe it isn't so good from a virus standpoint. Public transit use, you know, crammed on subways may not be very attractive. Smaller metropolitan areas, you know, hey, we've experimented with remote working. Smaller metros, suburbs, they see an increase in attractiveness. Now, the remote work that most of you are doing, is it a blip or is it a sea change? Will we go back? Some people argue we'll go back. People need to be in the office, for the exchange of ideas, that sort of thing. We're social creatures. Others argue, no, we're not going back. If we don't go back, think about the incredible implications for commercial real estate. Okay, we don't know how this is going to go. The digital access and the education disruption. Yeah, theoretically we can do stuff digitally in education, but there's a huge inequality aspect to it, as well, I think, as a quality aspect. How long is it going to take people to emerge from this trauma? When are they going to be comfortable dining out, traveling, crowds? We don't know. Oops. Another question. Emily?
All right. Our third question, have your savings patterns changed? And your options are A, no, B, increased savings, or C, reduced savings. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. And you can take a look at the results. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Emily. Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea what this was going to show, but increased savings, and that accords with previous economic trauma. It becomes more significant to have a reserve fund around, that sort of thing, more liquid assets to cope with the unexpected. But think about what that implies from a demand standpoint. Consumer demand may have to be supplemented by other sources. Okay. Okay, other sort of observations and considerations. I think most people on this call probably know that our medical system is a historical accident tied to the Second World War and price controls, where companies were allowed to provide medical insurance without violating the price controls, and the IRS said it wasn't taxable income. Okay, we're still living with that system. So when you've got medical access tied to employment, and you have, of course, this massive reduction in employment, there's a risk there for some people that they're going to lose their medical coverage at a time of pandemic. If you remember, under Obamacare, when it was first passed, there was a mandate to have medical coverage or pay a penalty. That was repealed. Okay, what's the safety net going to look like after coronavirus? Okay, I mean, all of a sudden, the medical stuff is extraordinarily important, and theoretically, many states have expanded Medicaid. You could theoretically buy insurance on the exchanges, but is that going to be satisfactory when you're dealing with a pandemic? Will that change? Telemedicine. We've seen a slow start to telemedicine prior to this event, but now it's expanded dramatically and likely become more accepted. Compensation is changing. We'll likely continue to see a lot more of that. Now, paid sick leave. A lot of us have paid sick leave. Many people do not. Okay. When you have a pandemic and you try to say, okay, don't come to work if you're showing these symptoms, well, if you don't have paid sick leave, there's going to be tremendous incentive to continue to come to work. As a device to help minimize the spread of the pandemic, there'll be a lot more attention focused on paid sick leave. And since many of us, I suspect, are in the financial services business, and we've probably got customers and forbearance or deferrals, who's going to be left standing? We've got moratoriums on evictions, that sort of thing, delayed rent. What kinds of debt burdens are we building up? Who will be able to survive this? What's going to happen to our perceptions of risk if we're on the lending side of things? We've got these massive reserves being taken. We don't know where this is going or how this is going to all end. Then we get to modern monetary theory. I talked earlier about we've increased the deficit significantly. There is a school of thought that says, don't worry about it, okay? We are borrowing in our own currency. We can't go bankrupt. And we can just borrow and spend, use fiscal policy to tighten when inflationary pressures develop. We seem to be experimenting with this now. Now, I suspect, if you think back a few years, a lot of the worries about the deficit, crowding out, that it might result in inflation if it was monetized, that people would not be willing to buy the paper, that stuff didn't happen, okay? And if we didn't have the low inflation, we would probably not see the Federal Reserve doing the policies that it is. But we are now doing a modern monetary theory experiment. We are spending, we are borrowing, and we are waiting to see what happens with this. Another question is, will fiscal policy tighten too soon? If you remember, after the last downturn, okay, in 2007 to 2009, fiscal policy tightened, and it played a role in the slow nature of the upturn that we had. Well, these are decisions that are going to be made this week with the expiring unemployment compensation or extra unemployment compensation. Congress is trying to figure out what is going to become or what's coming down the road. It's a risk. I don't know what's going to happen. You've got the two proposals that I talked about later. As you look at what's going on, I keep coming back to Joseph Schumpeter, 1958, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He talked about the notion of creative destruction. New stuff replaces old stuff. Now, new ways of doing things replacing old ways of doing things. We oftentimes think of this in terms of technology. But as I think about this, you've got the technology. Amazon and the stuff we're doing right now, it's been out there for a while, but it's gotten new impetus from the pandemic. And then the changing rules and regulations. I think you can think about this as a creative destruction, kind of environment. That leads to churn. And what I mean by churn is some companies disappear, some jobs disappear, new ones appear. Okay, that's really what we're going through. Now that graph on the right-hand side of this slide is from Baker, Bloom, and Davis on policy uncertainty in the United States. Notice what's happened, the surge in uncertainty. You see the word uncertainty used all the time by Chairman Powell in his speeches. They measure uncertainty by the use of the word in major national dailies, by the dispersion of forecasts, and expiring tax provisions. The point is there is a lot of uncertainty in the United States and economic policy right now. And I think we have to bear that in mind. Okay. So where are we going? I don't feel too badly about this slide. The second quarter may see an annual decline at a 30 to 40% annual rate, and it came in essentially at 32.9%, so the low end of the range. Okay. The Congressional Budget Office, for example, says the third quarter we may see a rebound at a rate close to 19%. Growth next year at about 4.8. That's where we are. Assuming that the downturn ended in the second quarter, it will start to see an upturn in the third quarter. But the nature of that upturn is very much unclear. We've seen that rebound in cases. We're growing now, but really the virus and the response call the tune. I think you can argue, this is a test of our society, the institutions, people and firms. My last slide before we get to the last question is let's go out 10 years. Okay. And you have to look back at this. I'm too old. I won't be looking back at this in 10 years. And I think we'll have to ask ourselves, all right, did the safety net change? The things that I talked about, the medical stuff. Did that support system change as a result of this downturn? Did we deal with the inequality revealed by the pandemic and the social turmoil? You saw the pandemic hit low-income people, minorities, the hardest. We've got the social turmoil going on at the same time. Did we deal with this? And then the debt burdens legacy. We're spending like mad right now in an effort to support the economy. That debt's going to be out there. What is going to be its legacies? Maybe the things we used to worry about will come back. Okay. Maybe we'll see upward pressure on interest rates, crowding out of other spending, or inflation. We don't know. That's going to be this is new territory for the United States. It's a new approach. What will be the role and size of government? We've seen a massive expansion in federal spending and the benefit programs. How long will they last? After the Great Depression, the economy changed significantly. The role and size of government changed. And did our business change? We work in businesses that were probably back in January, you're saying, okay, we're in pretty good shape. This upturn ought to go on for at least another year. But that's a world that does not exist anymore. How are we going to adjust to that world? How over the 10 years, assuming we're looking back, did we change? I think those are big questions that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, let's go with one last question.
All right, our final question. Have you changed your vacation plans for the summer? And your options are A, no, B, yes, I'll be driving, not flying, C, yes, staycation, D, yes, we've postponed or canceled our plans. And once you have completed all CPE requirements today, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. We'll just give it a couple more seconds here. And let's go ahead and take a look at the results. John, back to you.
Okay. That's interesting. Didn't have much idea what that was going to look like. Postponed or canceled. I was wondering if most people would end up driving, but it's postponed or canceled. Well, interesting. If you look at the answers to the questions, we've got a group of people, working from home, not eating out as much, increasing their savings, and postponing their vacations. Sort of interesting and consistent with the nature of this downturn. It's an incredible, exciting time. And, obviously one would like to be a little more certain about what's going to happen. But that's why I started with that notion of radical uncertainty. We've not been here before. And it's promises to be a very exciting time. I'd be glad to take a few minutes and try to answer any questions.
Thanks, John. Dustin here. We did have a question that wanted to run by you here. And the question is, can the Fed keep buying bonds without expanding its balance sheet to the point of damaging the dollar to the point it's not a reserve currency?
Whoa, great question. All right. Yeah, I think the Fed can keep going. And if you look at the statement yesterday after the meeting, the Fed said they're going to continue their expansive policy and do what's necessary to support the economy. You've seen them run up the balance sheet dramatically. The dollar, the world is being flooded with liquidity. Other central banks are expanding stuff as well. You've seen a big jump in gold and silver prices. But if you think about the dollar as a reserve currency, you ask, where else are you going to go? We still have positive rates here. You've got negative rates in many other parts of the world. The markets are still sort of deep here. People have talked about the end of the dollar as a reserve currency. I hope it doesn't happen. We got a lot of benefits. We get a lot of benefits from that. I don't think there's a good alternative at the present time to the dollar as a reserve currency.
Thank you, John. We had one additional question just came through, and what impact on the economy next year, if there is or isn't a new president? And I guess I'll take a quick moment as a plug. John was nice enough to bookend our webcast series both today and then in November after the election, and so that intentionally was to be able to speak to this in real time in November. But any thoughts you have at the moment, John, on the election?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch, but I think you've got to look. Of course, it's not just the president; it's what's happened. What happens in the Senate is going to be extraordinarily important. It takes time to change policy. I mean, you'll have fiscal policy set presumably in the next few weeks. The Fed has pushed rates to zero and indicated it's going to continue to support the economy. Big changes in policy will have to come, I think, other than monetary policy, well into 2021. It may change expectations, and you may, of course, get changed sort of medical policies more quickly.
Thank you, John. That's all we had for questions.
All right. You do come up with another question for John, you may enter that in the Q&A window, and we will do our best to follow up with you after the presentation. Thank you, John, so much for your presentation today and taking the time to be with us. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation, thank you. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.